The cold bite of winter clung to Daniel as he sat on a worn-out park bench, staring at the last crumpled bill in his hand. Weeks of fruitless job hunting had drained him, leaving him with nothing but the growl of his empty stomach and the weight of despair hanging over him. The world around him seemed to move in slow motion, families laughing, children playing, all oblivious to his silent struggle. Just as he began to wonder how much longer he could hold on, he noticed a woman approaching him, her steps faltering and hesitant. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, with dark shadows under her eyes that spoke of countless sleepless nights. In her arms, she held a tiny, frail baby, bundled tightly against the cold. The woman stopped in front of Daniel, her eyes brimming with tears that threatened to spill over at any moment. Her voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with the weight of the words she struggled to say. She told him that her baby was gravely ill, in desperate need of an operation that she could not afford. The sheer hopelessness in her voice struck Daniel like a physical blow, pulling him out of his own misery and into hers. He could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of losing the most precious thing in her life. His heart ached for her, but he was torn. What could he possibly do? He had so little himself. Daniel looked down at the bill in his hand, feeling its crinkled edges between his fingers. It wasn't much, barely enough to get him through the next day or two, but it was all he had. His mind raced, weighing his own needs against the desperate plea of the woman standing before him. Could he really give up his last bit of security? The gnawing hunger in his stomach reminded him of his own precarious situation, but something deeper, something more profound, tugged at his conscience. He knew what it felt like to be on the brink, to feel as though the world was collapsing around you with no one to turn to. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Daniel extended his hand, offering the woman the only money he had left. The relief on her face was immediate, a flood of gratitude washing over her as she clutched the bill tightly to her chest. Her tears flowed freely now, but they were tears of hope, of a mother who had been given a lifeline, however small. Daniel watched as she hugged her baby closer, whispering words of comfort and thanks to both him and her child. It was a moment of raw humanity, where two strangers connected over the shared burden of suffering, if only for an instant. As the woman turned to leave, Daniel felt a hollow emptiness settle in his chest, different from the hunger that gnawed at his belly. It was the emptiness of sacrifice, of giving away the little he had left in a world that had already taken so much from him. He watched her walk away, her figure gradually fading into the dim light of the evening, until she was nothing more than a shadow among shadows. Daniel was left alone, colder and hungrier than before, but with a strange sense of peace that he couldn't quite explain. He had nothing now, but in that nothingness, there was a flicker of something, perhaps hope, or maybe just the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had done the right thing. The night descended quickly, and with it, the park grew quiet, the sounds of the city fading into the background. Daniel remained on the bench, his thoughts swirling like the cold wind that whipped through the trees. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely alone. That woman, with her fragile baby, had left him with something more valuable than money. She had reminded him of the simple truth that even in the darkest of times, a single act of kindness could light the way forward. It was a small comfort, but one that he held onto as he finally rose to his feet, ready to face whatever the night had in store for him. As Daniel walked away from the park, his footsteps echoing in the quiet, he couldn't help but wonder about the woman and her child. Would they be okay? Would the money he gave be enough to make a difference? Doubt crept into his mind, but he pushed it away, reminding himself that he had done all he could. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder that life went on, with or without him. Daniel pulled his coat tighter around him, bracing against the cold, as he made his way back to the small room he called home. He was empty-handed now, but his heart, though heavy, felt just a little bit lighter. Back in his room, Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, the silence pressing in on him. The walls seemed to close in, the reality of his situation sinking in once more. But as he lay down, pulling the thin blanket over himself, he found a strange sense of resolve within him. Life had not been kind to him, but that didn't mean he had to be unkind in return. He had given what little he had, and though he was left with nothing, he knew that in some small way, he had made a difference. And as sleep finally claimed him, Daniel found comfort in the thought that perhaps, just perhaps, things would turn out okay, for both him and the woman he had helped. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's life continued much as it had before. Day after day, scraping by, doing whatever odd jobs he could find. The woman and her baby, though still present in his thoughts, began to fade into the background as the immediate concerns of survival took precedence. He found work wherever he could, washing dishes in a dingy diner, sweeping the floors of a convenience store after hours. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't enough to pull him out of poverty, but it kept him afloat. The city's harshness was a constant companion, reminding him that kindness alone wasn't enough to survive. Despite the relentless grind, Daniel couldn't shake the memory of the woman's tear-streaked face and the quiet gratitude in her eyes. It lingered like a ghost, surfacing in quiet moments when he allowed himself to pause and reflect. But life has a way of burying even the most poignant memories under the weight of daily struggles. As the months passed, Daniel's focus shifted back to his own needs, his own survival. He managed to find a more stable job as a janitor in a small office building, and though it paid little, it was a step up from the uncertainty he had lived with for so long. Years went by, and Daniel's situation improved slowly, almost imperceptibly. He moved out of the cramped room he had called home for so long and into a modest apartment in a quieter part of the city. The neighborhood wasn't much, but it was safe, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt a sense of stability. He never forgot those lean years when every day was a battle to stay above water, but they began to feel like a distant memory. The city's pulse no longer felt as oppressive, and Daniel found himself appreciating the small comforts he had once taken for granted. A warm meal, a quiet evening, a roof over his head. Yet, even in the relative comfort of his new life, Daniel often reflected on the paths not taken, the lives that might have been. The woman and her child occasionally drifted into his thoughts, their faces blurred by time, but their impact on his heart remained. He had no way of knowing what had become of them, whether his small act of generosity had made any difference at all. But the thought of it brought him a strange comfort, a reminder that he had, at least once, been able to help someone in need. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep his spirit from hardening completely against the world's indifference. As Daniel settled into his new routine, the years continued to pass, each one blending into the next. He made friends with a few of his neighbors, attended the occasional community event, and slowly built a life that, while far from luxurious, was his own. The constant struggle for survival that had defined his youth began to fade, replaced by a quiet contentment. He never became wealthy, but he managed to live within his means, finding satisfaction in the simple pleasures that life had to offer. And through it all, the memory of that cold evening in the park remained with him, a small but significant thread woven into the fabric of his life. Daniel's career as a janitor was steady, if unremarkable. He took pride in his work, maintaining the small office building with care and diligence. It wasn't a job that many people noticed or appreciated, but it provided Daniel with a sense of purpose. He became a fixture in the building, known to the employees who worked there as a quiet, reliable presence. They might not have known his story, but they respected him for his hard work and dedication. and Daniel, in turn, found a sense of belonging in the routine, a place where he could contribute, even if in a small way. There were moments, however, when Daniel would pause in the middle of his duties, overcome by a sudden wave of reflection. He would think about the choices he had made, the people he had met, and the paths he had crossed. The faces of those he had helped or failed to help would flash before him, bringing with them a flood of emotions: regret, pride, sorrow, hope. It was in these moments that Daniel realized just how much those early experiences had shaped him, how the act of giving, even when he had nothing to give, had forged a core of resilience and compassion within him. Though Daniel's life had settled into a predictable rhythm, the world around him continued to change. He watched as the city evolved, new buildings rising where old ones had stood, neighborhoods transforming almost overnight. The faces of the people he passed on the street changed too, reflecting the ever-shifting tide of the city's population. And yet, despite these changes, Daniel felt a sense of continuity within himself, a thread that connected him to his past. The memory of the woman and her child was part of that thread, a reminder that his life, though unremarkable on the surface, was tied to the lives of others in ways he couldn't always see. 23 years had passed since that fateful evening in the park, and Daniel had settled into a life of quiet contentment. His modest apartment and stable job as a janitor had given him a sense of security that he had once thought unattainable. The struggles of his youth seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by the routine of daily life. But one day, something happened that would bring those memories rushing back. It began with a letter, delivered to his apartment in a plain envelope, with no return address. Daniel was puzzled as he turned it over in his hands, wondering who could have sent it. When he finally opened the letter, Daniel found himself reading an invitation to a meeting at a luxurious office building in the heart of the city, a place he had never been to before. The letter was formal, almost too formal, and it left him with more questions than answers. Who could possibly want to meet with him, and why? Despite his reservations, curiosity got the better of him, and Daniel decided to go. On the day of the meeting, he dressed in his best clothes, still feeling out of place as he made his way to the address listed on the letter. The building was imposing, a sleek tower of glass and steel that loomed over the city streets. As Daniel entered the building, he was immediately struck by the contrast between his simple life and the opulence around him. The lobby was vast, with marble floors that gleamed under the soft lighting, and receptionists who greeted him with polite smiles. He felt a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest as he approached the front desk, uncertain of what to say. But before he could speak, a young man appeared beside him, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit. The man introduced himself as David and extended a warm hand to Daniel. There was something familiar about his face, but Daniel couldn't quite place it. David led Daniel through the lobby and into a private elevator, where the silence was broken only by the soft hum of the machinery. As the elevator ascended, Daniel couldn't help but feel a sense of unease growing within him. What was he doing here? Why had this man, this stranger, gone to such lengths to find him? His mind raced with possibilities, each one more unlikely than the last. When the elevator doors finally opened, they stepped into a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. David gestured for Daniel to take a seat, and they both sat down at a polished wooden table. It was then that David began to speak, his voice calm and measured. He explained that he had been searching for Daniel for a long time, ever since he had learned about the man who had helped his mother all those years ago. At first, Daniel was confused, not fully understanding what David was saying. But as David continued, the pieces began to fall into place. The story he told was one that Daniel recognized all too well, about a young woman, desperate and alone, with a sick child and no means to save him. The realization hit Daniel like a bolt of lightning. This man sitting across from him was the baby he had once helped save. For a moment, Daniel was speechless, his mind struggling to process the revelation. The years melted away, and he found himself back in that park, handing over the last bit of money he had to a stranger in need. And now, here was that child, all grown up, sitting before him as a successful man. It was almost too much to take in. David's eyes were filled with gratitude as he thanked Daniel for the kindness he had shown his mother, explaining how that small act had changed the course of their lives. Daniel felt a mixture of emotions: shock, disbelief, and a deep, profound sense of wonder at the twists and turns of fate. David went on to describe how his mother had always spoken of the man who had saved them, and how he had vowed to find Daniel and thank him in person. As he listened, Daniel felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He had never expected to see any reward for what he had done that day. In fact, he had nearly forgotten about it altogether. But here was proof that his actions had mattered, that they had made a difference in the world. The realization was both humbling and uplifting, filling him with a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. The past and the present collided in that moment, leaving Daniel with a profound sense of connection to the man before him. As their conversation drew to a close, David extended an invitation for Daniel to visit his mother, who still remembered him fondly and wanted to thank him personally. The thought of seeing her again, after all these years, filled Daniel with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. He agreed, though he wasn't entirely sure what to expect. As he left the office and made his way back down to the bustling streets, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just been irrevocably changed. The city, which had once seemed so indifferent, now felt like a place of infinite possibilities, where even the smallest acts of kindness could echo through time. The next day, Daniel found himself standing at the entrance of a quiet, suburban home, his heart pounding in his chest. The house was modest, with a well-kept garden and a welcoming aura that contrasted sharply with the city's coldness. As he stood there, he couldn't help but feel a sense of surrealism wash over him. How had he ended up here, after all these years? It seemed almost like a dream, as if at any moment he might wake up back in his small apartment, the letter nothing but a figment of his imagination. But this was real, and the woman who had once been a distant memory was now only a few steps away. David greeted him at the door with a warm smile, guiding him inside with the same gentle demeanor he had shown the day before. The house was filled with the scent of fresh flowers, and the walls were adorned with family photos, each one telling a story of love, resilience, and joy. As they walked through the hallway, Daniel's eyes were drawn to a particular photo, a black and white image of a young woman holding a baby, both of them smiling despite the obvious challenges they had faced. It was her, the woman from the park, now older, but still recognizable. The sight of her brought a lump to his throat. When they entered the living room, Daniel was struck by the warmth and coziness of the space. The woman, now in her late 50s, rose slowly from a comfortable armchair by the window, her face lighting up with recognition as she saw him. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I never thought I'd see you again." The years had been kind to her in some ways, but the lines on her face spoke of the struggles she had endured. Her eyes, however, remained bright, filled with the same gratitude and hope that he had seen on that cold day so many years ago. Daniel found himself overwhelmed with emotion, unsure of how to respond. She approached him with slow, deliberate steps, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to take his. "You saved us," she said softly, tears welling up in her eyes. "You gave me the strength to keep going when I had nothing left. Without you, my son wouldn't be here today." Her words hit Daniel with the force of a tidal wave, sweeping away the years of doubt and uncertainty that had plagued him. He had always wondered if what he had done that day had truly made a difference. Now, standing here in the presence of the woman and the child he had helped, he knew the answer. As they sat down together, the conversation flowed naturally with the woman, whose name was Margaret, recounting the years that had passed since their encounter. She spoke of the hardships they had faced, the challenges of raising a sick child with no money, and the eventual miracle of finding a doctor willing to perform the surgery. Daniel listened intently, his heart aching with every detail. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for their story, as though his small act of kindness had set off a chain of events that had led them to this moment. It was both humbling and inspiring, leaving him with a newfound sense of purpose. Margaret went on to explain how David had grown up to be the man he was today, a successful, compassionate individual who had dedicated his life to helping others. She spoke of the pride she felt in him, and how she had always told him about the man who had given them hope when they had none. "You were our guardian angel," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You appeared when we needed you most, and you gave us the courage to keep fighting." Daniel could only nod, his own emotions too overwhelming to put into words. He had never considered himself a hero, but hearing her speak, he began to see the impact of his actions in a new light. As the afternoon wore on, the three of them shared stories, laughter, and tears. It was a reunion filled with emotion, each of them grateful for the chance to reconnect after so many years. For Daniel, it was a moment of profound healing, a chance to finally come to terms with the past and the choices he had made. He realized that his life, though marked by struggle and hardship, had been meaningful in ways he had never imagined. The connection he felt with Margaret and David was undeniable, a bond forged through kindness and perseverance. It was as if they had become a family, bound together by the threads of fate. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the room, Margaret took Daniel's hand once more. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Thank you for everything. You've given us more than you could ever know." Daniel felt a deep sense of peace wash over him, as though a weight he hadn't even known he was carrying had finally been lifted. He had spent so many years wondering if his life had mattered, if the sacrifices he had made had been worth it. Now, in this moment, he knew the answer. His actions had mattered. They had changed lives, and in doing so, they had changed him as well. In the days following their emotional reunion, Daniel found himself in deep reflection. The memories of the past, the unexpected reunion with Margaret and David, and the overwhelming gratitude they had expressed left him feeling both humbled and unsettled. It was as if a door had been opened to a part of his life that he had long since closed, and now, everything he had thought he knew about himself was being called into question. He had lived his life simply, with few expectations, and yet, here he was, being offered something beyond his wildest dreams. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. One afternoon, as they sat together in the same cozy living room where they had first reunited, David broached the subject that had been weighing heavily on his mind. "Daniel," he began, his tone serious but warm, "I want to do more than just thank you. I want to offer you something that reflects the gratitude my mother and I feel." Daniel listened, his heart beginning to race. He had no idea what David was about to propose, but he could sense that it was something significant. David paused, searching for the right words, before finally continuing. "I want you to join me in my company, as a partner." The offer hung in the air, heavy with implications. Daniel stared at David, trying to process what he had just heard. A partner? In a successful business? It was a proposition so far removed from his reality that it seemed almost absurd. He had spent his life scraping by, doing whatever work he could find just to survive. The idea of stepping into a world of wealth and power was both thrilling and terrifying. "David, I don't know what to say," Daniel stammered, feeling a wave of anxiety rise within him. He had never aspired to wealth or status. His life had always been about getting by, one day at a time. David smiled gently, understanding the turmoil Daniel was experiencing. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said, "but I believe you have something unique to offer. Your kindness, your integrity. These are qualities that are invaluable in the business world, but also rare. You helped us when we had nothing, and now I want to help you build something meaningful." Daniel felt his heart skip a beat. The sincerity in David's voice was undeniable, but so was the fear that gripped him. He had never seen himself as someone who could navigate the complexities of business, let alone thrive in such an environment. As the conversation continued, Daniel found himself wrestling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, the offer was incredibly generous, an opportunity to not only secure his future but also to make a difference in the lives of others, just as he had done all those years ago. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into a world that he didn't belong in, a world that might change him in ways he wasn't prepared for. "I'm just a janitor," he thought to himself, the words echoing in his mind. "What do I know about running a company?" The doubts gnawed at him, making it hard to see the potential in David's offer. David, sensing Daniel's hesitation, leaned forward and spoke with a renewed sense of urgency. "Daniel, I'm not just offering you a job. I'm offering you a chance to be part of something bigger. Together, we can create opportunities for others who are struggling, just as you were. We can make a real difference." The passion in David's voice was palpable, and for a moment, Daniel allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to work alongside him, to build something that mattered. But the fear of the unknown still held him back, making it difficult to fully embrace the vision David was presenting. Margaret, who had been quietly observing the conversation, finally spoke up. "Daniel, you've always been someone who puts others before yourself. That's why this offer is so perfect for you. It's not about money or status. It's about continuing to do what you've always done, helping others." Her words struck a chord deep within Daniel, resonating with a truth he had always known but rarely acknowledged. He had spent his life helping others in small ways, but this was an opportunity to do so on a much larger scale. The thought was both exhilarating and overwhelming, leaving him torn between the comfort of his old life and the promise of something greater. In the end, Daniel knew that the decision he faced was not just about accepting or declining an offer. It was about choosing the direction his life would take from this point forward. Would he continue to live as he always had, in the safety of the familiar? Or would he take a leap of faith and embrace the unknown? The conflict raged within him, and as he sat there, surrounded by the warmth and support of the people whose lives he had touched, he realized that whatever choice he made, it would define him in ways he had never anticipated. The days following David's offer were filled with a tension that Daniel hadn't felt in years. His mind was a battlefield of conflicting thoughts and emotions, each one vying for dominance as he tried to make sense of the choice before him. On the one hand, the offer was a dream come true, a chance to change his life in ways he had never imagined. But on the other, it was terrifying. The fear of losing himself, of becoming someone he didn't recognize, loomed large over every thought. He spent sleepless nights pacing his small apartment, going over every possible outcome, every potential risk. One evening, unable to bear the weight of his thoughts any longer, Daniel decided to confront his fears head-on. He called David and asked if they could meet, needing to talk things through before he could make any decision. David agreed without hesitation, and they arranged to meet at a quiet cafe not far from where Daniel lived. As Daniel walked to the cafe, he felt a sense of calm wash over him, as though simply deciding to talk about his concerns had lifted some of the burden from his shoulders. He arrived early, taking a seat by the window where he could watch the world go by as he waited for David. When David arrived, He greeted Daniel with a warm smile, sensing the gravity of the conversation that was about to unfold. They ordered coffee, and once the cups were in front of them, Daniel took a deep breath and began to speak. He told David about his fears. The fear of stepping into a world he didn't understand, the fear of losing himself in the pursuit of something he wasn't sure he wanted. He spoke of his past, of the struggles that had shaped him, and how those experiences had made him wary of anything that seemed too good to be true. David listened intently, his expression thoughtful and understanding. When Daniel finished, David leaned back in his chair, taking a moment to gather his thoughts before responding. "I understand your concerns, Daniel," he said gently, "and I don't want you to feel pressured into making a decision you're not comfortable with. But I do want you to know that this offer isn't just about business. It's about the values that you've lived by your entire life: kindness, integrity, and compassion. Those are the things that matter most, and they're what I believe you can bring to the table." Daniel nodded, appreciating David's honesty, but the fear still lingered, a shadow that refused to be dispelled so easily. David continued, his voice steady and reassuring. "I'm not asking you to change who you are, Daniel. In fact, I'm asking you to be exactly who you are, because that's what makes you so valuable. I know this is a big step, but I also believe that together, we can create something that will make a real difference in the world." His words resonated deeply with Daniel, touching on the very core of his identity. He had always valued humility and sincerity, and the thought of being able to apply those principles on a larger scale was both exciting and daunting. But the question remained, was he ready to take that step? After a long pause, Daniel spoke again, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I fail?" It was a question that had haunted him for as long as he could remember, a fear that had kept him from pursuing anything beyond the safety of what he knew. David's response was immediate and unwavering. "You won't fail, because you'll have me by your side. We'll face the challenges together, just as we're sitting here together now. And if you ever feel lost or unsure, I'll be there to help you find your way." The sincerity in David's voice was undeniable, and for the first time, Daniel began to see the possibility of a future where he wasn't alone. As the conversation drew to a close, Daniel found himself at a crossroads. The fear of the unknown still loomed large, but so did the opportunity for growth, for connection, for making a difference in ways he had never imagined. He realized that the decision he faced wasn't just about accepting an offer. It was about embracing a new chapter in his life, one that would require courage and trust, but also offer the chance for fulfillment and purpose. David's words echoed in his mind as he left the cafe, the weight of the decision still heavy but no longer unbearable. For the first time in days, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope, a small but growing belief that maybe, just maybe, he could do this. That night, as he lay in bed, Daniel thought back to all the times in his life when he had faced uncertainty and fear. He had always managed to find a way through, even when the odds were stacked against him. This time, though the stakes were higher, he realized that the same resilience that had carried him through those difficult times could also guide him now. It wasn't about being fearless. It was about finding the strength to move forward despite the fear. And in that moment of clarity, Daniel made his decision. The morning after his decision, Daniel woke up with a sense of clarity that had eluded him for days. The fears and doubts that had plagued him were still there, but they no longer held the same power over him. He had made up his mind. He would accept David's offer and step into this new chapter of his life with an open heart and a willingness to learn. As he got dressed, he felt a mix of excitement and nervousness bubbling up inside him. This was the beginning of something entirely new, something he had never imagined for himself. But it was also an opportunity to finally put the values he had lived by into action on a much larger scale. Daniel met with David later that day, and when he told him of his decision, the relief and happiness on David's face were palpable. I knew you'd come around, David said with a grin, his voice filled with warmth and sincerity. We're going to do great things together, Daniel. I'm so glad you're on board. The two men shook hands, sealing the deal that would change both of their lives. For Daniel, it was a moment of quiet triumph, a validation of everything he had struggled through. He had spent so many years wondering if his life had mattered, if his choices had made any real difference. Now, he had a chance to see the impact of his actions unfold in ways he had never expected. The first few weeks in his new role were a whirlwind of activity. Daniel was introduced to the team at David's company, and while he felt out of his depth at times, the support and encouragement he received made all the difference. David had been true to his word, guiding Daniel through the complexities of the business world with patience and understanding. The learning curve was steep, but Daniel found himself rising to the challenge, driven by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer just a janitor, no longer defined by the struggles of his past. He was part of something bigger now, something that had the potential to make a real difference in the lives of others. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel began to find his footing. He became more confident in his new role, learning the ins and outs of the business and contributing his own unique perspective. His past experiences, once a source of shame and hardship, now served as a valuable asset, giving him insights that others might not have. He and David worked closely together, developing programs aimed at helping those in need. People who, like Daniel once had, were struggling to get by. It was fulfilling work, and Daniel found himself thriving in the new environment, driven by a renewed sense of purpose. The partnership between Daniel and David grew stronger with each passing day, not just as colleagues, but as friends. They shared a common vision, a desire to use their success to lift others up, and this bond became the foundation of their work together. Daniel's humility and compassion complemented David's drive and ambition, creating a dynamic that allowed them to accomplish more than they ever could have on their own. They launched initiatives to provide education and job training for those in need, built partnerships with other organizations to expand their reach, and developed a reputation for being a company that cared about more than just profits. For Daniel, the most rewarding part of his new role was seeing the direct impact of their work on the lives of others. He met people who reminded him of himself, people who were struggling to find their way in a world that often seemed indifferent to their plight. Each time he saw someone succeed, someone who had been given a chance to build a better life, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. It wasn't just about the work. It was about the lives they were changing, the hope they were giving to those who had none. And in those moments, Daniel knew he had made the right choice. As the company continued to grow and evolve, so too did Daniel. He found himself taking on more responsibility, becoming more involved in the decision-making processes that shaped the direction of the business. But despite his success, he never lost sight of the values that had brought him here in the first place. He remained grounded, always mindful of the lessons he had learned during the hardest times of his life. And through it all, he carried with him the memory of that cold evening in the park, the moment when a small act of kindness had set him on a path that would lead to something far greater than he had ever imagined. As the years passed, Daniel often found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The life he had built with David and the impact their work had on so many lives filled him with a deep sense of satisfaction and pride. But more than anything, it was the realization of how one small act of kindness had rippled through time, creating waves of change that had transformed not only his own life but the lives of countless others. He could hardly believe how much had changed since that cold evening in the park when he had handed over his last bit of money to a desperate mother and her sick child. Every time Daniel looked back on that moment, he was struck by the incredible power of that simple gesture. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it, just a fleeting decision made out of compassion for someone who seemed to need help even more than he did. But now, He could see how that single act had set in motion a chain of events that had led to this new chapter in his life. It was humbling to realize that his small sacrifice had been the catalyst for so much good, that his willingness to help, even when he had little to give, had made such a profound difference. The work that Daniel and David did together continued to grow and evolve, touching more lives than they had ever imagined possible. They expanded their efforts, reaching out to communities in need, providing resources and support to those who were struggling to make ends meet. And through it all, Daniel remained committed to the values that had guided him from the beginning: kindness, humility, and a deep sense of responsibility to others. He knew that none of this would have been possible without that fateful encounter all those years ago, and he was determined to honor the legacy of that moment by continuing to pay it forward. There were times when Daniel would visit the very park where it had all begun, sitting on the same bench where he had once felt so lost and alone. It was a quiet place, a place of reflection, where he could remember the man he had been and the journey he had taken to become the man he was now. The park had changed little over the years, but Daniel had changed in ways he never could have imagined. He was no longer just a survivor, no longer just a man trying to get by. He was someone who had made a difference, someone who had used his own experiences to help others find their way. The bond between Daniel and David grew stronger with each passing year, forged by their shared mission and the deep respect they had for one another. They became not just partners in business, but brothers in spirit, united by the knowledge that they were doing something that truly mattered. Daniel often marveled at how far they had come, how a chance meeting had led to a partnership that had touched so many lives. And in those moments, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the success they had achieved, but for the opportunity to give back, to be a part of something larger than himself. As Daniel entered his later years, he began to think more about the legacy he would leave behind. He knew that the work he had done with David would continue, carried on by those who shared their vision and values. But more than that, he hoped that his story would serve as a reminder to others of the power of kindness, of the incredible impact that even the smallest act of generosity could have. He wanted people to know that no matter how difficult their circumstances, no matter how little they had, they always had the ability to make a difference. And that, in the end, was what truly mattered. The story of Daniel's life, and the lives he had touched, was one of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of human connection. It was a story that spoke to the heart, a testament to the idea that we are all connected, that our actions, no matter how small, can have far-reaching consequences. As Daniel reflected on his journey, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he had lived a life of purpose, a life that had made a difference. And as he looked out at the world, he knew that the impact of his kindness would continue to ripple through time, touching lives in ways he could never have imagined. As this chapter of Daniel's life comes to a close, it's a powerful reminder that our actions, no matter how small, can have a profound impact. If you were moved by this story, I invite you to think about how you can make a difference in the lives of those around you. Your kindness could be the spark that changes someone's life forever. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video if you enjoyed it, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to support more stories like this, check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the pinned comment. Let's continue to spread hope and compassion, one story at a time.